Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Texas Messenger Podcast. Here we champion public education over political agendas and platforms. I'm Jason Carter, and I'm not a Republican, and I'm not a Democrat. I'm just a fed-up Texan on a mission to inform and empower fellow Texans on issues facing public education in the Lone Star State. In today's show, we are going to take a look at a part of a video I was sent from an interview on school choice. Are you ready? The Texas Messenger Podcast starts in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Today's interview comes from the Texas Public Policy Foundation's podcast, The Right Idea, featuring Texas House candidate for District 62, Shelley Luther. The host of the show is Brian Phillips. He's the Chief Communications Officer for the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and Ariana Guajardo, a videographer for the foundation. Now, in the first clip, Brian starts out by setting the scene for the questions on school choice. Let's take a listen.
Issues, would love to hear it. Number one, of course, is school choice. This is Texas. We're TPPF. We're contractually obligated to talk about school choice every 11 minutes or so. And so we're going to start there with school choice. This last legislative session, there was a tremendous amount of progress made, particularly considering the last 20, 25 years on this issue. These false narratives that people in the rural communities don't support school choice, or that that we're defunding education. All of that came out, and the left came with full guns blazing on this, Shelley. And yet here we are. We're at the cusp. For school choice proponents, we feel like this is going to be our legislative session. What's your take on kind of the way that this debate manifested over the last year and a half, and kind of what to look forward to as we go into the next legislative session?
Well, my district is very rural. We have a lot of growth that's coming into our district. And honestly, I hope that it's a lot of school options that happen. We have kind of a clean slate up here. But right now, we voted, I think it was in the 70th percentile of people that voted and said we are for school choice and we are for the money following the child.
Okay, so let's go through this point by point. Let's start with false narrative number one. The left is coming out with guns blazing and opposing school choice. Well, actually, you had quite a few Republicans that were not for school choice either, and they even voted against school choice legislation. And many of those were actively campaigned against by Governor Abbott, and there were campaigns to oust the incumbents, along with the negative ads that were funded by super PACs that included donors from out of state. Then we get into the false narrative about people in rural communities do not support school choice. Well, I don't know if that's necessarily a false narrative, because let's look at these charts right here. Private schools are concentrated in urban areas with very few in rural areas of the state. Now, in the two charts shown, you can see a comparison between the number of locations of public school districts across the state. Those are on the left in purple. And then on the right in green is the number of locations of the private schools in Texas. Now, what is illustrated is the concentration of private schools are located in urban areas, with very few of those found in rural Texas. Now, when you overlay the two charts, you can see that the number of schools across the state that are not located near a private school. To say that rural schools are in favor of school choice is a little bit misleading. Now, many rural areas, and I do mean rural areas of the state, there's only one school within 40 or more miles. And let's face it, the reason for school choice push is not rural Texas. It has everything to do with urban areas of the state. It has nothing to do with rural Texas. What does affect rural Texas is that they need those legislatures to vote for school choice for it to pass. Now, what evidence is there that rural areas of the state support state taxpayer money going to religious private schools? Now, I can go on a limb because I lived my entire life in rural Texas. Many in rural areas of the state believe in fairness, and whatever rules and regulations are imposed on public schools, they should also apply to any school that takes taxpayer funding. Then Brian goes on to say that another false narrative is that school choice is defunding public education. Well, here's the way I look at it. When you are using money that could be allotted to address many of the underfunded and unfunded mandates imposed by schools by the legislature. And you use those monies to fund new programs that essentially give money to entities that do not have to follow the same rules. Well, I call it diversion. I don't necessarily call it defunding. Now, then the question is posed to Miss Luther about school choice, and she is indicating that 70% of the voters who voted indicated that they were for school choice and in favor of the money following the child. Now, what she is referring to is Proposition 11 on the Republican primary ballot. Now, this is what it says on Proposition 11. Texas parents and guardians should have the right to select schools, whether public or private, for their children, and the funding should follow the student. Now, the question does not distinguish the difference between non-secular and secular private schools. It's quite funny how questions are posed to fit the narrative, right? Taxpayers may not be so inclined to allow their taxpayer funding to go to secular private schools, where practices may go against their values as taxpayers. Now, the Attorney General of Texas, Ken Paxton, has already issued an opinion which states that if you open the door for private school subsidies, you cannot exclude religious private schools. The outcome of Proposition 11 very well could be different if the distinction was made that private schools could also be secular. And there's a reason why it was framed the way that it was. It fit the narrative. All right, so now let's turn our attention to the actual results of voting for Proposition 11. Now, there were 2.2 million voters who cast their votes for the proposition. Almost 1.8 million registered voters voted. That's almost 80% in favor of the proposition, with a little over 460,000, that's around 20%, voted against the proposition. Now, let's look at the same data from a different perspective. All right, so this chart shows something very similar to the previous chart, but in Texas, there were over 17.9 million eligible voters. Over 87% of registered voters did not vote on Proposition 11. Only 12% of registered voters did vote on Proposition 11. Taking into account all registered voters, those voting in favor of Proposition 11 went from 80% to 10%. In simple terms, ladies and gentlemen, this is not a mandate. So let's recap what we have discussed in this episode. First, there are more than just the left that oppose school choice. Also, it's a bit of a stretch to say that rural parts of Texas support school choice when many do not have viable options available. And it could be argued that parents in rural areas would rather the state focus on improving traditional public schools in their communities and funding them properly. I think, too, Republicans who approach school choice will use one set of figures to say that they have a mandate to push for school choice. And in the end, when we look at the actual data, the actual election results, the majority of Texas voters did not even weigh in on the propositional language. And there is not a generated need for school choice, but the narrative did not fit the reality. And therefore, we want to create language that gives us the narrative, that gives us the push. But when we see the full details of how many registered voters actually voted, it gives a different picture. Thank you for listening, and let's keep the conversation going on our Facebook group, the Texas Messenger Roundtable. You can join the group at facebook.com/group/TXM Roundtable. Or find the link in the show notes, or it'll be also in the YouTube description. As we wrap up, let's pledge to stay informed, stay engaged, and continue advocating for Texas public schools. Together, we can make a meaningful difference in the lives of our students and communities. Until next time, take care, and see you soon.